This is the first intercontinental conference of colored peoples, so-called colored peoples, in the history of mankind.
Welcome to the Third World. My name is Pranay Somayajula. I'm a writer, organizer, and host of Return to Bandung, a podcast that explores questions of imperialism, resistance, and internationalist solidarity throughout history and into the present day. Through historical analysis, interviews with expert guests, and deep dives into classic works of anti-colonial theory, Return to Bandung seeks to make the case for why anti-imperialist politics are as important in our current moment as ever before. Broadcasting to you from Minneapolis, Minnesota, the heartland of the American Empire, this is Return to Bandung. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you are in the world, and whatever time of day it is for you, welcome back to Return to Bandung. It's great to have you here. It's been a while since I last released an episode of this show. You may recall, if you listened to my most recent episode that came out earlier this summer, the interview I did with Pablo Wargan, which if you haven't had a chance to listen, I highly recommend that you do. But in that conversation, I'd mentioned I'd be taking the month of August off from producing new episodes because I was in the process of moving from Washington, D.C. to Minneapolis, where I am recording this now. And you may have noticed, of course, that the introduction to the episode has changed. I am no longer in the belly of the beast, as it were, but I am now in the heartland of the American Empire. And so I've updated the intro to these episodes to reflect that. I've come to Minnesota, where I grew up, to start a PhD program at the University of Minnesota, PhD in political science, specializing in political theory and international relations. And by the time this episode comes out in early September, I will have just started my classes, and I'm really looking forward to being back in an academic environment, studying these issues of imperialism and resistance. I'm going to be researching colonial counterinsurgency practices in the British Empire. And so the topics I'll be engaging with in my academic engagements will be very similar to those that I cover here on this show. So I'm really excited to find ways to bring my academic work as a grad student into conversation with the work I do hosting this podcast and the political education project that Return to Bandung seeks to be. Now, I know it's been a while since the last episode of this show came out, but I am more than ready to hit the ground running once again with some very exciting interviews coming out in the next few episodes, conversations with folks whose work I really respect, really admire, and have had a really wonderful time being in conversation with them. I cannot wait to share those conversations with you all, the listeners. In addition, I've also got some pretty exciting things planned for future episodes later this fall, new types of collaborations with partners, and new formats of episodes as well. So stay tuned for more on that front in the coming weeks and months. Now, as I mentioned, I've got some great interviews coming up for these next few episodes, but as I get back into things after this brief hiatus of the last month, I thought it would be nice to switch things up a little bit and share a slightly different kind of episode with you all. So some of y'all may know that earlier this summer, over July 4th weekend, I was in Chicago at the Socialism 2025 conference put on every year in Chicago by Haymarket Books. And this year at the Socialism Conference, I actually gave a talk. The title of the talk was "This is the Human Race Speaking, Reviving the Bandung Spirit in a Multipolar World." And of course, listeners may know that this year, 2025, marks the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference, which not only gave this podcast its name, but also really inaugurated the Third Worldist movement and the era of non-alignment and global South, self-determination and self-assertion. So a really important historical moment. And in my talk for the conference, I wanted to look back on the 70 years that have passed since the Bandung Conference, look back on the legacies of this really pivotal moment in Third World history, in anti-colonial history, and internationalist history, and make sense of where we are today. What lessons can we derive from that moment and the experience of what came after it, to shape our approach to understanding and navigating the really tectonic shifts that we are living through every day here in our present world. China's president Xi Jinping often talks about changes unseen in a century, and it certainly feels every day that I wake up and turn on the news like we are living through more and more and more changes unseen in a century, particularly as we talk about something that's come up a lot on this show, which is the emergence of an increasingly multipolar world order. And so in the talk that I gave at the conference, the text of which I also published as an essay on my Substack, which I'll link that in the show notes as well if you want to follow along. But in the talk that I gave at the conference in July, I wanted to sort of step back and take a bit of a bird's eye view of a lot of the themes of third worldism, of the shifting global order, and so on that come up time and time again in the conversations that I have on episodes of this podcast, and look at all of these developments in a bigger picture, again, with the historical reference point of the Bandung Conference having taken place 70 years ago. And so that's exactly what I did, and that culminated in the lecture that I gave, which was recorded. And so today's episode is actually going to be the recording of that lecture that I gave at the Socialism conference. And I wanted to, before jumping into sharing that recording, reflect a little bit on what the experience was like of preparing and delivering this talk. Something that we often talk about in anti-imperialist circles, a frustration that I've certainly given voice to on this show and in organizing conversations before, and a frustration that I'm sure many of my listeners share, is that here in the United States, in the heart of empire, in the imperial core, even on the left, among people who consider themselves to be very radical, to be anti-capitalist, to be socialists, even to be Marxists, or call themselves anti-imperialists, there is in fact a pretty significant lack of a real consciousness or analysis around what imperialism actually is, around how empire functions in the world today, and about why it is so important that we stand in solidarity with peoples and with countries that are facing imperialist attacks. Because as we know, it's not actually possible to overthrow systems of oppression here in the imperial core. It's not actually possible to overthrow capitalism, to win a socialist future, to win a liberated future, if we're not also talking about the need to be overthrowing imperialism. But something we often encounter is even Western leftists, even the most radical, or at least self-professed radical among us, will end up reinforcing imperialist narratives, repeating State Department and CIA talking points, particularly in the sorts of very unprincipled and bad faith criticisms leveled against actually existing socialist projects that are bearing the brunt, really, of imperialist aggression, whether we're talking about the Cuban Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and the current successes of socialist China, whether we're talking about the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela, which is under continual attack by U.S. imperialism, particularly with the most recent news of a massive bounty being placed on the head of Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro. These projects, really require solidarity from internationalists and leftists and socialists in the imperial core, but we often don't see that solidarity being shown. And I was a little apprehensive going into the conference. This was my second time at the Socialism conference. It's held every year at the same venue in Chicago, and there were a handful of international speakers, but for the most part, it is a conference of American socialists gathering. And given the track record of the American left, I certainly was a little bit worried about what kind of reception would my talk receive? What kind of pushback might I get about claims that I'm, soft peddling authoritarianism, or not putting enough emphasis on so-called democracy and human rights. Again, these are narratives that you're just as likely to hear in American socialist meetings as you are to hear on CNN or read in the pages of the New York Times. But what I found instead was that when I actually arrived in Chicago and when I gave this lecture to a room of audience members, the response was really incredibly positive. The discussion that people had, which was not unfortunately recorded, but the sorts of Q&A, the questions people were raising during the Q&A, the discussion points that were being raised, because it was very much a conversation. It wasn't just a Q&A. People were sharing their reflections as well. It was really, really rich and nuanced. And I came away from that experience with a pleasantly surprised feeling that the people who were gathered here at this conference actually already had the seeds of an anti-imperialist consciousness that were more developed than even I saw when I was at the conference last year. And I think that was reflected not just in the response to my talk and the sorts of conversations that I had with people after giving this talk, but it was also reflected in the overall program of the conference itself. The conference was much bigger than it was last year. In fact, they announced during Robin D.G. Kelly's keynote speech that this was the largest the conference had ever been. Multiple thousand people there, I think 2,000 or 3,000 people in attendance. It had spilled over into new floors of the convention center and so on. And of the many panels that covered all sorts of different topics over the course of the weekend that have been organized, there were noticeably more panels than there were last year that were dealing with international questions, that were dealing with really crucial questions of how should the socialist left in the U.S. orient itself towards this or that issue. And obviously, I don't agree with everything that every single speaker at the conference said. It wouldn't be a very good conference, frankly, if I did agree with everything that everyone said. The point is to have a forum for debate and discussion in a comradely manner. But it really left me feeling quite heartened, to be honest, to know that the American left is thinking in these international terms that we weren't even just a few years ago. I came of age. I entered into political consciousness on the left when I was in high school with the Bernie Sanders 2016 presidential campaign. That was my first introduction to the word socialism as something that doesn't have to be a scary word. And that was when I started identifying as a socialist, even though I didn't fully understand what it really meant at the time. And even then, the center of gravity on the American left was really focused around this very narrow social democratic vision of an increased welfare state here in the US. Maybe, some talk about fewer American interventions abroad. We shouldn't be trying to do regime change efforts. We shouldn't be sending our troops overseas. No more wars. But it was, generally speaking, a really narrow domestic focus on domestic social programs, talking about universal health care, a Green New Deal, and so on. And not that these programs aren't important, but on the left, even in the DSA and other socialist spaces that I was a part of at the time, and even into college as well, there wasn't this international consciousness, this understanding that we can't talk about opposing capitalism if we're not talking about opposing capitalism on a global scale, because capitalism is, as we've talked about ad nauseum on this show, a world system. But what we've really seen, I think, over these last few years, and of course, as I mentioned before, a really critical turning point in that was the ongoing genocide in Gaza that the Zionist entity is carrying out, and the entire Western world's unflinching support for it. I think that's been a key pivotal turning point in awakening an internationalist consciousness among so many people, not just in the United States, but across the imperial core, across Canada, across Western Europe. So many people who have always been just teetering at the edge of an internationalist consciousness have finally come into it. And I think that the student intifada of last spring and the student movement more broadly has played an especially key role in awakening people to that consciousness. And so, looking back now, especially it's been a couple months since I gave this talk, it actually isn't surprising at all, the response that my talk received and the generally more internationalist orientation that I found at the conference this year, because of all these developments that we've seen unfold, especially in the last several months since Donald Trump came to power here in the US. We have seen fascism really taking root here in America, and that taking the form of the imperial boomerang, the same tactics and methods and tools and frameworks of repression and violence deployed abroad across the world, but especially to genocidal effect in Palestine, are now being turned onto American soil against people who are here, whether American citizens or non-citizens. We are really seeing the collapsing of this artificial distinction between what's happening, quote unquote, at home and what's happening, quote unquote, abroad. In reality, I think there's a growing understanding that all of these different fields of struggle are interconnected, and that the fight against fascism at home is one and the same. It's not just interconnected, but it is the one and the same with the fight against imperialism and genocide abroad. And I think that is really important context to bear in mind as you listen to what I talk about in this lecture, again, taking this bird's eye view of the juncture we find ourselves in presently in the world, in the global order, this precipice that we really are at. I think it is not an exaggeration to say that, certainly more so than at any other point in my lifetime, we are at a crossroads. Is it going to be socialism or barbarism on a global scale? I think there's a lot of things in the world order right now that are terrifying, that are heartbreaking, and make it very difficult to have any sort of optimism about the future, right? I mean, we are about to observe 2 years since the genocide in Palestine began. We are, we are continuing to see the acceleration of militarism, of far-right fascist nationalism, not just in the US, but around the world. All of these horrible things are happening, but at the same time, there's also a lot happening in the world right now that I do think, and I'm not just saying this, I really do believe, contains the seeds of a liberated world within it. I think these shifts that we are witnessing right now in the global order, as the contradictions of the capitalist imperialist system heighten and approach and start to reach a crisis point, I think we really are seeing an opportunity, a moment of opportunity starting to open up for socialists and anti-imperialists all over the world to seize that moment and to alter the course of disaster that we are currently on. Of course, we cannot talk about any of this without also talking about the existential menace of climate change, which of course does come up in my lecture. But I think that it really is safe to say that we are at a moment, we are at a global crossroads, this juncture where things could go in the direction of socialism, or they could go in the direction of barbarism, as Rosa Luxemburg famously put it. And I think it's important for us in the imperial core to remember that we have a really crucial role to play. We are in the belly of the beast. Whether or not we're in Washington, D.C., we are still in the heart of empire. We can strike at the snake from within. We can do everything we can to bring the war machine, bring the hydra that is American empire to its knees from within. And there are so many people taking so many different forms of heroic and courageous action and resistance, especially right now, again, as fascism is being deployed with increasingly devastating effects on the streets of American cities, including in Washington, D.C., where I just moved away from and have been really heartbroken to watch the deployment of the National Guard and other federal officers on the streets of the city that I love so much. But I've also been watching the forms of resistance that D.C.'s residents are engaging in to show the fascists they're not welcome here. I think we need to see more of that. We need to see more action against arms manufacturers, against war profiteers, against the politicians who are complicit in genocide, who are complicit in imperialist expansion. We have this really important role to play. But also, I think it's important for us to remember, and this might be a hard pill for some American leftists to swallow, I think it's really important for us to remember that we are not the sole agents of history. We are not the protagonists of history. There are millions of people, millions and millions of people around the world, in the third world, in the global south, in the countries that have been ravaged for centuries by the imperialist world system, first in the form of colonialism and then in the form of neocolonialism that continues to oppress and strangle their societies to this day. They are the ones who are carrying the banner of revolution forward, whether it's the heroic resistance fighters in Palestine and in Yemen and in Lebanon, or whether it is the Alliance of Sahel states standing up against French neocolonialism, whether it's people's movements like the MST in Brazil and similar movements all over Latin America and elsewhere, the people of Venezuela defending the Bolivarian Revolution, the people of Cuba defending the Cuban Revolution against imperialist attacks. Really, anywhere you look around the world, we are seeing the people of the Third World rise up and stand against the forces of imperialism. They are the ones who are carrying the banner of world revolution forward. I often on this show quote that very famous statement by Ghassan Kanafani, the Palestinian revolutionary, where he says that imperialism has laid its body over the world. Wherever you strike it, you damage it, and you serve the world revolution. We are seeing the banner of that world revolution being carried forward by the peoples of the Third World, and it is our responsibility as anti-imperialists and as revolutionaries here in the imperial core to follow the lead of the people who are carrying that banner forward. And so I just want to share that as framing for the way I was thinking about the topics that I cover in this lecture when I was thinking about what to write, what to say to this audience of American socialists about the need for internationalist solidarity, for, as I say in the title of the lecture, reviving the Bandung Spirit in a multipolar world. What will it take for us to overcome the forces of imperialism, of fascism, of global reaction? What will it take for us to bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old, as the lyrics of the song Solidarity Forever remind us? So with that, I will stop talking and will turn it over to myself from a couple months ago to discuss the legacies of the Bandung Spirit and Third Worldism. As always, if you enjoyed this episode and you want to support Return to Bandung, please do take a moment to subscribe to the show and leave a review or a 5-star rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever app you're listening to this on. And please also take a moment to follow us on social media at Return to Bandung on Instagram and Twitter, and to share the show with anyone in your life who might benefit from hearing the revolutionary, anti-imperialist perspective this show hopes to bring. Now, with that housekeeping out of the way, let's get into it. My talk today is called This is the Human Race Speaking, Reviving the Bandung Spirit in a Multipolar World. In the spring of 1955, the legendary African-American writer Richard Wright was traveling in Spain on literary business, collecting material for a book that he would publish 2 years later under the title Pagan Spain. By the middle of April, his work in the country was complete. But rather than returning to Paris, where Wright had been living in voluntary exile for the last 9 years, he instead took a train to Madrid, where he boarded a flight that would take him halfway around the world to Indonesia, specifically to the city of Bandung. Located around 87 miles southeast of Jakarta, Bandung is Indonesia's third largest metropolis and the capital of the country's largest province, West Java. The city's relatively cool climate, nestled into a mountain basin in the West Java highlands at an elevation of some 2,500 feet above sea level, has long made it a popular resort town for Jakartans looking to escape the heat and crowds of the Indonesian capital. But what brought Wright to Bandung in April of 1955 was no weekend getaway. In fact, he had come as an observer to attend the Afro-Asian Conference, more commonly known as the Bandung Conference, an international gathering of leaders from across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, organized primarily by Indonesian President Sukarno and Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, and held from April 18th to 24th, 1955 in central Bandung's Merdeka building. Wright was one of several American journalists who had come to Bandung to attend the conference, his travel arrangements paid for by the Paris-based Congress for Cultural Freedom, an entity that, as would be revealed nearly a decade later, had been covertly funded by the CIA since its inception. Wright's experiences and observations at Bandung were compiled into his book, The Color Curtain, which was published in 1956 and remains to this day one of the most significant first-hand accounts of this historic gathering. In the book's first chapter, Wright describes what went through his mind when, thumbing through a newspaper in Paris several months earlier, he first encountered the announcement that representatives of nearly 30 newly independent nations across Asia and Africa would be gathering in Bandung to discuss, as the article put it, quote, racialism and colonialism. He writes, quote, the despised, the insulted, the hurt, the dispossessed. In short, the underdogs of the human race were meeting. Here was class and racial and religious consciousness on a global scale. Who had thought of organizing such a meeting? And what had these nations in common? Nothing, it seemed to me, but what their past relationship to the Western world had made them feel. This meeting of the rejected was in itself a kind of judgment upon that Western world, end quote. In this section of the book, Wright goes on to recount an exchange with his wife, in which she presses him on why it's so important that he travel to Indonesia immediately after spending several weeks in Spain. To this, Wright replies, quote, "I know that people are tired of hearing of these hot, muddy, faraway places filled with people yelling for freedom. But this is the human race speaking." This year, 2025, marks the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference. It is, I think, difficult for us now, 7 decades on from Bandung, to fully appreciate the scale and ambition of what the conference represented. At a time when the world was nowhere near as interconnected as it is today, when an ocean away still really did mean an ocean away, the Bandung Conference brought together representatives from 29 nations across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Among these were communist states like China and North Vietnam, secular nationalist republics like India and Egypt, and hereditary monarchies like Thailand, Ethiopia, and Saudi Arabia. Together, they combined to represent some 1.5 billion people, more than half of the world's population at the time. The Bandung Conference is widely recognized by scholars and activists alike as the birthplace of Third Worldism, a political movement that swept the colonized and decolonizing world throughout the latter half of the 20th century, characterized by a spirit of solidarity and cooperation between global South countries who, by virtue of their shared experience of colonial exploitation, remained forcibly relegated to the periphery of a world system dominated by rivalry between the great powers of the Cold War. As the Marxist historian Vijay Prashad puts it in the introduction to his seminal book, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, quote, "The Third World was not a place, it was a project." Bandung, of course, was not the first international gathering dedicated to galvanizing a global anti-imperialist struggle. That distinction would go to the congresses of the Comintern-backed League Against Imperialism, which first met in Brussels in 1927. But what set it apart from its predecessors was the fact that by the time the Bandung Conference was convened in 1955, vast swaths of the Third World had either already won, or were in the process of winning, independence from European colonialism. The gathering at Bandung thus represented the confirmation of what millions of people across the world, from the streets of Delhi and Beijing to the boardrooms of New York and London, already knew to be true. That the tide was turning, the global order shifting, and the age of Western imperial powers acting as the sole agents of history rapidly coming to a close. In his opening speech welcoming delegates to the conference, Indonesia's President Sukarno declared, quote, "This is the first intercontinental conference of colored peoples, so-called colored peoples, in the history of mankind." I want to pause for a moment and draw attention to that parenthetical, so-called colored peoples. The turn of phrase that Sukarno employs here says, I think, a great deal about the significance of what Bandung represented. Not just to the delegates who attended the conference itself, but to millions of people around the world whose hopes, dreams, and struggles were wrapped up in the Third Worldist project. By coming together at Bandung, the nations of the formerly colonized world, what Vijay Prashad calls the darker nations, were sending the message to Europe and to the West that they were no longer content to be relegated to the second-class status of colored people, whether as colonized subjects or as a dependent neo-colonial periphery. Here we can thus recall Wright's assertion in The Color Curtain that, quote, "this meeting of the rejected was in itself a kind of judgment upon the Western world." As I previously mentioned, the grouping of nations that gathered at Bandung could not have been further from anything remotely resembling a unified or homogeneous bloc. Political differences between delegates, particularly between those representing liberal nationalist governments and those representing more socialist-oriented states, were at times stark, and the countries gathered at Bandung differed widely in their degree of friendliness or hostility towards the West, at least insofar as their bilateral relations were concerned. And yet, this staggeringly diverse array of countries was nevertheless tied together by a common thread: the shared experience of having been subjugated by centuries of colonialism and of having been forced, even after achieving nominal independence, into a dependent and subordinate position within the capitalist imperialist world system. Thus, even in the absence of any shared ideological commitments amid the Cold War confrontation between capitalism and communism, the Third World was still able to coalesce around a common political project, one aimed at radically reshaping the world order from the ground up, transforming it from a system structurally designed to facilitate the imperial core's ruthless exploitation of the periphery into one characterized by peaceful coexistence, international cooperation, and genuine sovereign equality among states. As Sukarno put it in his opening address, quote, "All of us, I am certain, are united by more important things than those which superficially divide us. We are united, for instance, by a common detestation of colonialism in whatever form it appears. We are united by a common detestation of racialism, and we are united by a common determination to preserve and stabilize peace in the world," end quote. The ethos of anti-colonial internationalism that found expression at the Bandung Conference, and in the Third World Project more broadly, has come to be known as the Bandung Spirit. The essential contours of this Bandung Spirit were laid out most succinctly in the conference's final communique, issued on April 24th, which calls for nations to, quote, "live together in peace with one another as good neighbors, and develop friendly cooperation," based on the following 10 principles. 1. Respect for fundamental human rights and the Charter of the United Nations. 2. Respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations. 3. Recognition of the equality of all races and of the equality of all nations, large and small. 4. Abstention from intervention or interference in the internal affairs of another country. 5. Respect for the right of each nation to defend itself, singly or collectively. 6. Abstention from the use of arrangements of collective defense to serve the particular interests of any of the big powers, and B. Abstention by any country from exerting pressures on other countries. 7. Refraining from acts or threats of aggression or the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any country. 8. Settlement of all international disputes by peaceful means. 9. Promotion of mutual interest and cooperation. And 10. Respect for justice and international obligations, end quote. What we see reflected in these 10 points is a radical politics of third world solidarity, at once defiantly nationalist in its assertion of sovereignty and self-determination, and yet unmistakably internationalist in its globe-spanning reach. It was then, and remains to this day, a powerful example of what the political scientist Adam Getachew, who is speaking at this conference tomorrow evening, calls anticolonial world-making. In the first chapter of her brilliant book, World-Making After Empire, Getachew defines this project as one of, quote, overcoming international hierarchy and constituting a post-imperial world. She writes, quote, anti-colonial world-making was viewed not as an alternative to or rejection of nationalism, but instead as a necessary vehicle for securing national independence. Central to this combination of nation-building and world-making was the view that the global project of European empire had radically transformed the economic and political conditions of the modern world in ways that required a similarly global anti-colonial project, end quote. This world-making project, in other words, was about more than just forging closer connections between newly independent former colonies or constructing a third world bloc to compete in the playing field of global geopolitics. Rather, it was about recognizing that just as the Global South's former colonizers had constructed the international order for their own benefit and on their own terms, the nations of the Third World had both the right and the collective power to reconstruct that order into something more just, more equitable, and more conducive to human flourishing. We can see this world-making nature of the Bandung Spirit reflected clearly in the 10 principles laid out by the conference's final communique, which offers a vision for the world order that applies not just to the nations of the Third World, but to every country on Earth. The Bandung Spirit extended far beyond the walls of the Merdeka building, and its echoes continue to reverberate long after the last delegate had filed out of the conference hall. In the decades that followed Bandung, Third Worldism, and the politics of Cold War non-alignment that accompanied it, quickly took on a life of its own, and came to represent something even more revolutionary than the relatively muted spirit of cooperation and coexistence espoused by the Bandung Conference itself. It's no coincidence, I think, that when we think back on Third Worldism today, the first leaders who come to mind are not respectable, pragmatic moderates like Nehru or Sukarno, but more explicitly revolutionary figures: Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, Thomas Sankara, Ho Chi Minh. It's telling that the figure we are now inclined to associate most strongly with 20th century Third Worldism is not that of a bespectacled diplomat in a conference hall, but rather that of the Palestinian fidai, the Vietnamese rice farmer, the Algerian mujahid. Rather than the politician's business suit, it is the guerrilla fighter's combat fatigues that in our contemporary imagination constitute the Third Worldist uniform. Of course, it's also telling that when we think back on Third Worldism today, we do so primarily in the past tense. From the outset, the very task of survival for the Third World proved to be a Herculean one. Not only had centuries of colonial plunder placed third world nations in a structurally disadvantaged position, trapping them in patterns of neocolonial underdevelopment and dependency that continued long after the achievement of nominal independence, but these same nations, in their pursuit of sovereignty and self-determination, also found themselves tragically caught in the crossfire of Cold War geopolitics. Of course, one of Third Worldism's central tenets was non-alignment in the great power rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. This, however, mattered little to the US-led capitalist imperialist bloc, for whom the Bandung Spirit's assertion of Southern agency and calls for a more just and equitable world order were, simply put, too communist for comfort. As a result, throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, Third World governments whose rhetoric and policies challenged the foundational assumptions of the imperialist world system found themselves the targets of Western-orchestrated coups, invasions, and assassinations. Leaders like Indonesia's Sukarno, Chile's Allende, Congo's Lumumba, and Burkina Faso's Sankara were overthrown and replaced by neocolonial puppet regimes and US-backed military dictatorships. These new regimes were all too happy to dismantle the developmentalist state-building projects of their predecessors in favor of throwing the doors open for their countries to be penetrated and exploited by foreign capital. Meanwhile, those who survived were subjected to a devastating neoliberal onslaught at the hands of multinational corporations and Western-dominated institutions like the IMF, which sought to bring the Third World to its knees by weaponizing a growing debt crisis and imposing brutal regimes of austerity, privatization, and deregulation in the name of structural adjustment. By the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union fell and the United States cemented its position as the undisputed hegemonic force in a newly unipolar world order, the world-making potential of the Bandung Spirit seemed like little more than a distant memory. Today, we're living through the devastating consequences of that world-making project's untimely demise, as the structural injustices of the world system that Third Worldism sought to challenge continue to grow starker with each passing day. Global inequality has grown steadily for the last 6 decades and is now reaching unprecedented heights, with the per capita income gap between the core and periphery increasing from $14,000 in 1960 to nearly $52,000 in 2023. The underdeveloped countries of the global periphery collectively owe more than $11.4 trillion in external public debt, and some 3.3 billion people around the world live in countries that spend more on debt payments than on health or on education. Despite making up just 15% of the world's population, the so-called advanced economies of the imperial core control more than 59% of voting shares in the International Monetary Fund, more than 56% in the World Bank, all while these same institutions continue to impose punishing neoliberal reforms that open debtor countries up even further to foreign capital at the expense of their most vulnerable populations. As these structural injustices have been exacerbated alongside the demise of the Third World, so too have the more existential threats that the Bandung Conference recognized and sought to avert. The entire latter half of the 20th century, of course, was haunted by the terrifying specter of nuclear war, and Bandung was no exception. The conference's final communique declared that nuclear disarmament was, quote, imperative to save mankind and civilization from the fear and prospect of wholesale destruction, end quote. Famously, after the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s, the liberal establishment across the imperialist West brashly proclaimed that the rise of a unipolar world would usher in a new era of perpetual peace and global stability. But recent escalations of nuclear tensions around the world betray the dangerous short-sightedness of this triumphalism. The recent cross-border clashes which brought India and Pakistan to the brink of all-out war, the United States' entry into the Zionist entity's war of aggression against the people of Iran, the US and NATO's persistent military hostility and provocation towards China and Russia, these are all sober reminders that insofar as the prospect of nuclear annihilation is concerned, the current arrangement of the imperialist world system has not, in fact, made the world a safer place. To this dire state of affairs, of course, we must also add the existential menace of the rapidly worsening climate crisis, whose devastating beginnings are already upon us and whose worst impacts still remain to be felt. The delegates who gathered at Bandung, 3/4 of a century ago, could not have known the scope or scale of the threat that anthropogenic climate change would come to pose for the survival of humanity, a threat on par with that posed by the nuclear question which featured so prominently on the conference's agenda. And yet the emergence of climate change as one of the defining issues of our time an issue that cannot be meaningfully separated from the historical and current realities of the imperialist world system, only underscores the crucial need, now more than ever, for precisely the sort of world-making anti-colonial internationalism that the Third World Project represented. We know, for example, that the United States, the European Union, and the other countries of the global north are collectively responsible for 86% of all carbon emissions beyond the planetary limit, and that the global south countries, who bear the least responsibility for these emissions, are nevertheless the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. We know also that under existing political economic arrangements, the so-called green transition that is increasingly being invoked by political and business elites across the imperial core risks simply opening up a lucrative new avenue for the exploitation of the global south through resource extraction and unequal exchange. The conclusion to be drawn from these sobering facts could not be more clear. The only politics capable of meeting this existential challenge is a resolutely anti-colonial one, rooted in international solidarity and foregrounding the sovereignty of the global south countries who are being made to pay the price for climate change. So where does all of this leave us? There can be little doubt that the moment we find ourselves in now is one of profound and deepening crisis. It is, however, also a moment of heightening contradictions, which means it is therefore a moment of opportunity. The structural antagonisms that have long simmered beneath the surface of the US-led liberal international order are finally reaching a boiling point, and as a result, cracks are beginning to emerge in the very foundations of that order. Decades of failed neoliberal governance have fueled a right-wing national populist backlash across the West, with Donald Trump and the MAGA far right leading the charge here in the United States. The result, even in just a few short months of the second Trump administration, has been an unprecedented withdrawal of the US from the leadership role that it has traditionally occupied on the world stage. This withdrawal has manifested in numerous ways, from the embrace of protectionist trade wars to the abandonment of liberal internationalism in favor of a retreat to the crude hemispheric expansionism of the Monroe Doctrine. Among the most significant such manifestations of America's international withdrawal under Trump has been the fracturing of the transatlanticist consensus of US-Europe cooperation, a consensus that emerged in the aftermath of World War II and was cemented in the early 1990s with America's ascendance as the sole hegemon in a unipolar world. Alongside the United States' protracted imperial decline, which has been accelerated by Trump's withdrawal, but whose roots in fact run far deeper than that, we've also seen the meteoric rise of socialist China as a new superpower on the world stage, which has sparked panic among the US ruling class and fueled the intensification of a new Cold War. China's growing international presence has opened up crucial new avenues for the development and empowerment of countries across the global south, particularly in Africa and Latin America. To these countries, China offers not only an alternative source of foreign investment and assistance that is far preferable to the predations of Western-dominated financial institutions, but also a deeply compelling alternative model of development and international engagement, one that elevates sovereignty over dependency, cooperation over antagonism, and mutual benefit over narrow self-interest. Meanwhile, the Zionist entity's barbaric genocide against the Palestinian people, a genocide that was inaugurated, not under Trump, but under the liberal Democrat Joe Biden, and that has been materially supported for nearly 2 years now by governments across the imperialist West, has, in spectacular and horrific fashion, given the lie to the so-called rules-based international order, laying bare its blood-soaked hypocrisy for the entire world to see. The world historical significance of this particular veil being pulled back cannot be overstated. Beyond shattering the veneer of liberal internationalism that has long underpinned the US-dominated imperial order, the genocide in Gaza has also empowered global South countries to stand up to the West and challenge this order in new and unprecedented ways, as evidenced by South Africa's historic genocide case against Israel before the International Court of Justice, or by the recent formation of the Hague Group, whose 9 member states are convening later this month in Bogota, Colombia, where they will announce, quote, concrete actions to enforce international law through coordinated state action, end quote. These are just a few especially prominent examples of the tectonic shifts that have been underway in the global order over the last few years, as the contradictions of the status quo reach a breaking point and the world becomes increasingly multipolar with each passing day. This list, of course, doesn't even take into account the rapid expansion of the BRICS geopolitical grouping, whose 19 members and partner states collectively comprise more than 55% of the world's population, and more than 42% of the global economy. Nor does it take into account the growing interest among Global South countries in pursuing alternatives to the currency hegemony of the US dollar, an interest fueled not only by declining trust in the United States' own economic stability, but also by a desire to escape the stranglehold of US sanctions the dollar imperialism enables. Taken together, these myriad upheavals herald a crisis of imperial legitimacy, on a scale unlike anything the world has seen since European empires began to collapse in the mid-20th century, amid the first wave of decolonization movements and national liberation struggles. As a result of these shifts, we've seen the emergence of what Vijay Prashad and the Tricontinental Institute have called a new mood in the Global South, as Southern countries take an increasingly assertive stance against the pressures and predations of the West. In a recent dossier on the legacies and lessons of the Bandung Spirit, Tricontinental researchers define the new mood as follows, quote, "The principal objectives of the new mood in the Global South are rooted in two concepts, regionalism and multilateralism, both motivated by a desire to democratize the world order in economic and political terms," end quote. The aforementioned response of Southern nations to the Gaza genocide is a clear example of this new mood, as is the wave of anti-colonial and pan-Africanist sentiment sweeping across the African continent, manifesting most notably in the formation of the Alliance of Sahel States by the governments of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. As these unprecedented global shifts play out before our eyes, it's hard not to be reminded of the heyday of the Third World, and of the world-making potential that this radical project of anti-colonial internationalism contained within it. The parallels between the new mood and the Bandung Spirit are certainly there, and they're certainly striking, but we must be careful not to overstate the case. As Prashad puts it in a recent newsletter for Tricontinental, quote, "This mood is not the same as the spirit. It is merely a hint of a new possibility," end quote. The sobering reality is that unlike during the golden age of Third Worldism, when the Global South's pursuit of national sovereignty was accompanied by and intertwined with a profound emphasis on international solidarity, the new mood that we're seeing take hold in the Global South today does not quite have that same internationalist dimension, at least not to the same degree. Instead, the fracturing of the current international order and the emergence of an increasingly multipolar world has largely been characterized by individual countries pursuing more favorable terms for their own national integration into the capitalist imperialist world system. There is undoubtedly a greater emphasis on multilateralism and South-South cooperation than in the past, but this still functions more as a means to an end than as an end in itself, in the sense that many Southern governments have still shown a general willingness to align themselves in various ways with the imperial core as and when it suits their national interest to do so. In other words, unlike with the Bandung Spirit of the 20th century, what we are witnessing today is the emergence of a new politics of non-alignment without Third Worldism. This new ethos complicates the logic of the imperialist world system without directly challenging it. A world-altering project, certainly, but not quite a world-making one. What then would it take to revive the Bandung Spirit for our present moment? There is no easy answer to this question, but I think a crucial first step is to rekindle anti-imperialism as a central concern of left politics. For too long, the left in the imperial core, particularly here in the United States, has failed to place the appropriate amount of emphasis on anti-imperialism, at best relegating it to secondary status, and at worst ignoring or even abandoning it altogether. This abject failure of political vision stems largely from pervasive misconceptions about what imperialism is and how it functions in the world today, treating it either as being merely synonymous with war and militarism, or else as a bygone historical injustice in need of retrospective redress rather than as a central pillar of our contemporary world order. This myopic approach can and should be contrasted with the anti-imperialist politics of the Bandung Spirit. What ultimately made this politics so revolutionary and underpinned its world-making potential was the crucial understanding that imperialism is first and foremost a system of globally stratified political economy characterized by an international division of labor and the unequal exchange between the nations of the core and periphery, which continues to exploit the latter even after they have achieved nominal independence from formal colonial rule. This system is not separate from the capitalist system that we as socialists oppose. It is capitalism, manifesting on a global scale and, as Vladimir Lenin famously observed, at its highest stage of development. This means, therefore, that rather than being ancillary to our anti-capitalist struggle, anti-imperialism and international solidarity must, in fact, lie at the very heart of it. This is true for socialists and communists across the world, but it is especially true for those of us who are located in the imperial core and working to resist empire from within, even as we benefit from it. As I prepare to close out these remarks, I will leave you today with the words of the revolutionary Palestinian writer, freedom fighter, and martyr Ghassan Kanafani. Before his assassination by Zionist intelligence forces in 1972, Kanafani said, quote, "Imperialism has laid its body over the world, the head in Eastern Asia, the heart in the Middle East, its arteries reaching Africa and Latin America. Wherever you strike it, you damage it, and you serve the world revolution." End quote. Reviving the Bandung Spirit for our time means taking Kanafani's words to heart, never forgetting that the struggle against imperialism is not just part of the world revolution, it is the world revolution. To engage in that struggle is to take part in the same world-making project that millions of people across the Third World took part in when they rose up to break the shackles of colonial oppression and declare with one voice that, as Richard Wright put it, this is the human race speaking. We must never lose sight of the fact that as different as today's world may seem from the world that those freedom fighters inhabited, our contemporary struggles are nevertheless a part of that same revolutionary lineage. We must recognize that if we want to overcome the structures that continue to exploit and immiserate vast swaths of the world's population, then our efforts, like those of the Third World revolutionaries who came before us, must be aimed at nothing less than the complete and total remaking of the entire global order as we know it. That is an ambitious project, to be sure. But if we want to ensure humanity's survival in the face of the myriad existential crises confronting us, it is also a profoundly necessary one, and one for which we simply have no other choice. The world, dear comrades, is not just ours to win. It's ours to build. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode of Return to Bandung, please be sure to subscribe to the show and leave a review or a 5-star rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please also follow us on social media. We're at Return to Bandung on Instagram and Twitter, and be sure to share this episode with anyone in your life who might enjoy listening. And of course, if you have any questions, feedback, ideas, or suggestions, please do get in touch at returntobandung@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you.